In the traditional historiography of the First Barons' War, Dover Castle is frequently introduced through a familiar shorthand, clavis Angliae, the key of England. According to this framing, the sieges of 1216 and 1217 appear as near mythic moments in which the fate of the English kingdom turned upon the survival of a single fortress perched above the Channel. Yet such a presentation, while not entirely without foundation, risks obscuring the more analytically significant question raised by the episode. Why did Prince Louis of France, a claimant with substantial baronial backing, early territorial success, and access to the most advanced siege techniques of the early 13th century, fail to translate these advantages into durable political control? Modern historiography increasingly suggests that the answer lies less in the symbolic value of Dover than in its functional role within a broader system of war. Dover was not merely a powerful castle. It was a critical node within a logistical and communications network that linked southern England to northern France. Its survival constrained Louis's operational freedom by threatening his maritime supply line, complicating reinforcement, and forcing him into a prolonged war of position rather than decisive maneuver. At the same time, Dover exemplified the mature form of castle-based defense in depth, in which layered fortifications, active garrison tactics, and engineering adaptability systematically resisted rapid decision. This analysis therefore approaches the sieges of Dover Castle not as isolated dramatic confrontations, but as an intersection of institutional resilience, maritime logistics, coalition politics, and siegecraft. By tracing the crisis from the Magna Carta settlement through French intervention, divided campaigning, regency consolidation, and ultimately naval interdiction at Sandwich, the evidence suggests that Dover's true significance lay in how it shaped and ultimately limited the strategic possibilities of cross-channel conquest. The events that culminated in the sieges of Dover Castle unfolded against a background of long-term geopolitical contraction, fiscal strain, and institutional instability within the Angevin polity. Since the loss of Normandy to Philip II of France in 1204, the English crown under King John had faced a persistent strategic dilemma. England remained formally committed to the recovery of its continental possessions, yet the material foundations that had once sustained Angevin power on both sides of the Channel had eroded. Royal authority was increasingly exercised within England itself, where the costs of continental ambition were borne disproportionately by a landed aristocracy already under pressure from legal, financial, and administrative innovation. Generally speaking, John's reign was marked by an aggressive exploitation of royal prerogatives in pursuit of revenue. Scutage was levied with unusual frequency. Reliefs were inflated. Wardships and marriages were monetized with little restraint, and judicial processes were often deployed as instruments of extraction rather than arbitration. According to contemporary sources, these practices were not merely resented, but perceived as violations of customary limits on kingship. The baronial opposition that emerged by the second decade of the 13th century was therefore not simply a reaction to defeat in France, but to what many nobles regarded as a systemic distortion of feudal obligation. The Magna Carta settlement of June 1515 represented an attempt to arrest this dynamic through institutional reform. Its clauses sought to regularize taxation, constrain arbitrary justice, and embed the king's exercise of power within a framework of consent and counsel. Yet the straddlement was structurally fragile. It rested on mutual trust that neither side possessed, and on enforcement mechanisms that fundamentally challenged royal sovereignty. When Pope Innocent III annulled the charter later that summer, declaring it void as having been imposed under duress, the political dispute was transformed into a civil war with international ramifications. It was within this context that the rebel barons turned to Prince Louis of France. Their decision reflected both desperation and calculation. Militarily, the rebels lacked cohesion and resources to defeat John outright. Politically, Louis offered dynastic plausibility through his marriage to Blanche of Castile, a granddaughter of Henry II, while also embodying an alternative to what was increasingly framed as tyrannical rule. Modern historiography emphasizes that this was not initially conceived as a nationalist conflict, but as a coalition war in which English baronial interests and Capetian strategic opportunity temporarily converged. Louis's landing in England in the spring of 1216 rapidly altered the balance of power. Within weeks, he had secured London, taken Winchester, and attracted the allegiance of a significant portion of the political community. Yet these early successes masked deep structural vulnerabilities. His position depended on sustained reinforcement across the Channel, continued baronial cooperation, and the neutralization of royalist strongholds that threatened his lines of communication. Among these, Dover Castle assumed a particular importance, not because it alone could decide the war, but because it governed the narrow maritime corridor upon which Louis's entire enterprise depended. The build-up to the siege of Dover thus reflected mounting structural pressures on both sides. Louis commanded a substantial expeditionary force composed of French knights, mercenaries, and allied contingents, but its cohesion was time-limited. Feudal service was seasonal, mercenary loyalty was contingent on regular pay, and the costs of prolonged siege warfare were considerable. Financing depended on a combination of Capetian support, English revenues, and anticipated political consolidation that had yet to materialize. At the same time, Louis's claim to the English crown remained canonically compromised by papal excommunication, narrowing his diplomatic options and discouraging full commitment from some potential allies. On the royalist side, institutional resilience proved more significant than numerical strength. Although King John himself inspired little loyalty, the administrative machinery of the English crown remained largely intact. Sheriffs, castellans, and justiciaries continued to operate, collecting revenues and maintaining garrisons in key fortresses. Castles such as Dover functioned as semi-autonomous operational centers, capable of sustaining resistance even when isolated. The appointment of experienced commanders, most notably Hubert de Burgh at Dover, reflected an understanding that survival, rather than decisive victory, could alter the strategic calculus over time. Operational realities further complicated Louis's position. The English Channel was not a neutral highway, but a contested environment, shaped by weather, navigation, and naval capacity. John's investment in the royal fleet, often overlooked in traditional narratives, now bore fruit. English ships could patrol estuaries, interdict convoys, and exploit storms that routinely disrupted medieval seaborne movement. The evidence suggests that maritime uncertainty imposed a constant friction on Louis's operations, magnifying the strategic significance of any fortress capable of threatening his ports of entry. Dover itself embodied the mature form of early 13th century fortification. Its layered defenses forced attackers to commit resources sequentially, absorbing time and manpower at each stage. The barbican, gatehouse, inner ward, and keep were not redundant obstacles, but components of a defensive system designed to deny rapid decision. Hubert de Burgh's garrison complemented this architecture with an active defensive doctrine. Sorties disrupted siege works, crossbow fire targeted exposed laborers, and engineering responses were rapidly improvised to seal breaches. According to contemporary accounts, this combination of material strength and tactical initiative consistently frustrated French efforts to convert localized success into operational breakthrough. The siege craft employed against Dover was, by the standards of the period, sophisticated. Mining, covered galleries, siege towers, and stone-throwing artillery were all deployed, reflecting a repertoire increasingly standardized across Western Europe. Later sources emphasize the introduction of a counterweight trebuchet during the renewed siege of 1217, possibly the first of its kind used in England. While this claim remains debated, there is broad agreement that siege engines were becoming more powerful and more central to operations. Yet the experience at Dover illustrates a crucial limitation. Enhanced destructive capacity did not guarantee decisive results when defenders retained depth, morale, and logistical endurance. By the autumn of 1216, the cumulative effects of time, cost, and divided attention forced Louis to lift the siege without resolution. This pause coincided with a critical political transformation. King John's death in October removed the central grievance around which opposition had coalesced. The accession of the young Henry III under the regency of William Marshal altered the institutional landscape. By reissuing a revised Magna Carta, the Regency offered a framework for reconciliation that addressed many baronial concerns without surrendering royal authority. Gradually, the coalition supporting Louis began to fragment. The renewed campaigning of 1217 exposed the full extent of Louis's strategic overextension. Committed simultaneously to operations at Dover and Lincoln, he remained dependent on reinforcements from France to offset attrition. Storms, English naval patrols, and finally decisive interdiction culminated in the Battle of Sandwich, where Louis's relief fleet was shattered. Deprived of maritime connectivity, his position in England became untenable. Negotiations followed, leading to the Treaty of Lambeth and Louis's withdrawal. In retrospect, the sieges of Dover Castle illustrate how medieval warfare was shaped less by isolated acts of valor or technological novelty than by the interaction of institutions, logistics, and coalition politics. Dover did not save England by standing alone. It constrained an invader long enough for political consolidation and maritime control to take effect. Its endurance allowed time to become a strategic ally of the royalist cause, demonstrating how fortresses could function as regulators of conflict, converting military stalemate into political resolution with long-term constitutional consequences. In the aftermath of Louis's withdrawal, the consequences of the Dover campaigns became visible not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual realignment of political and military structures within the English realm. The Treaty of Lambeth in September 1217 formally ended Louis's claim to the English crown and marked the collapse of the Franco-baronial coalition. Its terms were notably pragmatic rather than punitive. Louis renounced his pretensions, received compensation for his expenses, and withdrew his forces, while former rebels were reintegrated into the political community. Generally speaking, this settlement reflected exhaustion on all sides and a shared recognition that prolonged war of attrition had become unsustainable. For the minority government of Henry III, the survival of Dover and the failure of the French invasion had immediate institutional benefits. The Regency under William Marshal consolidated authority by presenting itself as a stabilizing force committed to lawful kingship rather than arbitrary rule. The reissue of Magna Carta in revised form, stripped of some of its more radical enforcement mechanisms, functioned less as a revolutionary charter than as a political instrument of reconciliation. According to modern historiography, its importance in this period lay not in abstract constitutional principle, but in its capacity to rebuild trust between crown and political elite after years of coercion and civil war. Militarily, the events of 1216–17 underscored the continuing centrality of castles within English defensive strategy. Dover Castle demonstrated how a well-provisioned garrison, operating within a layered fortification system and supported by active leadership, could resist even sustained and technically competent siege operations. The evidence suggests that siegecraft in this period had reached a level of sophistication where attackers could reliably breach outer works, yet still struggle to achieve decisive penetration against depth defenses. As a result, sieges increasingly became contests of endurance shaped by logistics, morale, and time, rather than by any single tactical innovation. Equally significant were the lessons drawn from the maritime dimension of the conflict. The English crown's ability to contest the Channel, interdict reinforcements, and exploit environmental factors such as storms proved decisive in the later stages of the war. The Battle of Sandwich did not merely defeat a fleet, it severed Louis's operational connectivity, rendering further resistance in England strategically futile. This episode highlights a broader point, often underemphasized in popular narratives of medieval warfare. Naval capacity, even when limited in scale, could exert disproportionate influence by shaping the flow of men, money, and information.
Economically, the war imposed severe strain on both sides. Prolonged sieges consumed vast quantities of timber, iron, food, and labor, while mercenary wages and shipping costs placed continuous pressure on treasuries. The countryside of southeastern England, repeatedly traversed and contested, suffered from systematic foraging and supply denial. Such conditions reinforced the logic of compromise once the balance of advantage shifted. Long-term consequences included a renewed awareness among English rulers of the financial limits of sustained continental intervention, a lesson that would resonate throughout the 13th century. Within the broader balance of power, the failure of Louis's invasion demonstrated the limits of the Capetian expansion across the Channel. Philip II had supported his son cautiously, avoiding full commitment that might provoke wider diplomatic repercussions. The outcome preserved England as a distinct political entity, while confirming the Channel as a hardened strategic frontier. Anglo-French rivalry would persist, but the events of 1216 to 1217 showed that conquest required more than dynastic claim and battlefield success. It demanded durable control over institutions and logistics.
When situated within the wider historiography of medieval warfare, the sieges of Dover invite a reassessment of familiar explanatory models. They challenge narratives that privilege singular battles or technological determinism, and instead point towards systemic analysis. Dover was neither saved by exceptional heroism nor lost by inadequate artillery. Rather, it functioned as a strategic regulator, slowing the tempo of war and imposing costs that an expeditionary coalition could not absorb indefinitely. Its resistance bought time for political realignment, naval interdiction, and institutional recovery to take effect. Ultimately, the historical significance of Dover in 1216 to 1217 lies in what it reveals about the mechanics of power in the early 13th century. Warfare was inseparable from governance, finance, and legitimacy. Fortresses mattered not as isolated monuments, but as nodes within networks of authority and supply. By constraining Louis's operational options, Dover helped ensure that the resolution of the First Barons' War would be decided not by foreign conquest, but by negotiated settlement and internal reform. In this sense, the castle's endurance contributed not only to the failure of a French invasion, but to the survival of a political order capable of evolving through institutional compromise rather than collapse. Taken together, the Dover campaigns therefore occupy a revealing position within the study of medieval and early modern warfare, precisely because they resist reduction to a single explanatory factor. They demonstrated that military outcomes in this period were rarely the product of battlefield superiority alone, and even less of symbolic gestures or individual reputation. Instead, they emerged from the interaction of institutional endurance, logistical coherence, and the capacity to exploit time as a strategic resource. Dover Castle did not defeat Prince Louis in a conventional sense. It constrained him, delayed him, and imposed costs that his coalition could not indefinitely sustain. Modern historiography has increasingly emphasized this systemic perspective. Where older narratives framed Dover as the dramatic hinge upon which English liberty turned, more recent scholarship situates it within a wider process of state survival under acute stress. The castle's resistance mattered because it allowed the English political community to reorganize itself following the death of King John. Without that interval of enforced stalemate, the regency of Henry III would have struggled to assert legitimacy, reissue the Magna Carta in a conciliatory form, and detach wavering barons from the French cause. In this sense, the military and the political were inseparable, each conditioning the possibilities of the other. The episode also reinforces an important methodological point for the study of medieval siege warfare. Technological development, including the increasing use of powerful artillery and systematic mining, did not eliminate the defensive advantages of well-designed fortifications. Rather, it shifted the balance toward prolonged engagements in which success depended upon sustaining manpower, supplies, and morale under adverse conditions. Dover illustrates how defense in depth, when combined with active garrison tactics and secure provisioning, could neutralize even technically competent siege operations. Finally, the failure of Louis's invasion underscores the strategic importance of maritime control in an age often characterized as overwhelmingly terrestrial in its military focus. The Channel functioned not merely as a boundary, but as an operational environment whose control determined the viability of cross-channel power projection. The English ability to contest that space, culminating in the defeat of French reinforcements at Sandwich, transformed a precarious defensive posture into strategic dominance. In conclusion, the sieges of Dover Castle are best understood not as an isolated drama, but as a case study in how medieval polities survived existential crises. They reveal a world in which castles regulated conflict, logistics shaped strategy, and political legitimacy could be rebuilt through institutional adaptation rather than decisive annihilation. Dover mattered because it forced war to slow down, and in doing so allowed governance to recover. That, more than any single assault or engine of war, explains its enduring place in the military history of medieval England.